In 16th century Scotland, a man named Sawney Beane apparently terrorized the countryside together with his clan of cave-dwelling cannibals. I'm Andrew Vandervaart, a resident and neuroscientist, and this is the Andrew Vandervaart Halloween Special. Right, so normally I cover true crime cases and talk about some forensic profiling related concepts and other psychopathology related issues. In this case, we have the legend of Sawney Beane, and we really don't know whether it's true or not for reasons I'll get into. But certainly it's a story that was written about in Scottish history and even in crime magazines, which were popular for periods of time. There was actually something called the Newgate Calendar, which was a publication detailing the executions at the famous prison Newgate. And it grew into a comprehensive collection of famous crimes. And it became one of the books from like the mid-1700s to the 1800s. It was found in many homes as a sort of moral warning to children about what can happen if they don't follow the tenets of right and wrong. What we do have in this case is a very spooky story. And we can also talk about some spooky pathology relating to cannibalism. So our story begins with Queen Elizabeth on the throne in England and King James on the throne in Scotland. The 16th century saw the birth of Alexander Sawney Beane in a small East Lothian village just outside Edinburgh. Now, Sawney's father was apparently an honest man, a laborer who made a living digging ditches and trimming hedges. But for Sawney, this was not a viable career path. He was said to have been lazy and vicious from a young age. He may have briefly attempted carrying on his father's line of work, but found it was not for him. By late adolescence or young adulthood, Sawney left home, having found a woman apparently of a similarly dishonest disposition, who he eventually married, and then set up a sort of life for themselves in a series of remote caves and tunnels. Now, why they decided to live in these caves and tunnels, we don't know. Perhaps just not wanting to come up with the money and payments for a more traditional accommodation. Although I guess you could say living in a cave is the most traditional accommodation. So they're living in these caves in Ayrshire, near the Scottish coast. And these are the Beane caves, which are a quite large series of passageways, but on these cliffs up against the ocean, such that at high tide, this network of caves would actually flood, but it would clear during low tide. And while most of us may find that somewhat unpleasant, having your foyer fill with water a couple times a day, it seemed to lend itself to the type of lifestyle that Sawney and his wife would begin to live, which was one of raiding and eventually killing passers-by. There were a number of lonely and narrow roads passing by the cliff face, and it became a relatively simple matter for Sawney to ambush these travelers. Now the problem was, most of these travelers didn't have a lot in the way of pure cash. Whatever they had, Sawney and his wife would take and use in local villages to procure food, but it was not enough to live on. When the travelers had valuables, Sawney Beane would steal these as well, but was shrewd enough to know that he couldn't very well sell these in the local villages because valuables at that time were fairly recognizable. You know, they weren't mass produced, and so it could easily connect him to the murdered victims. And of course, the other thing is there were now corpses littering the countryside. So to Sawney Beane, he had two problems. One, not enough money to buy food, and two, the bodies were left as evidence after these raids and murders. And so what did Sawney decide to do? Well, if he was murdering them, Sawney figured, why not eat them too? And so from this point on, cannibalism began to play a central role in the Beane cavehold. I was going to say household, but they lived in a cave, so I said cavehold. You see, after each robbery and murder, Sawney would bring the bodies back now, and between he and his wife, they would dismember, disembowel, and cure the meat from their victims. They would salt and pickle the flesh and hang it in the caves. To avoid detection, they did not discard the bones outside of the cave, but began stockpiling them in a remote corner of the cave. Now, this new practice of cannibalism that they had embarked on seemed to lead to an era of vigor in the Beane cave as the missus began to produce many children. The Beane children were raised in the caves and brought up on the same diet of human flesh as their parents, and it became a family routine. As the children grew up, they began accompanying Sawney Beane on his raids, robbing the travelers and locals and bringing the bodies back to the cave to provide the food for the others. Now, what was going on in these surrounding villages was initially they had noticed there were murders. There were murdered travelers whose bodies had been left, but now there were increasing numbers of disappearances. Suddenly there were hundreds of disappearances. And this led to enormous efforts made to try to find those responsible. However, the Beanes, living in this cliff face that was flooded with water during high tides, were never discovered. So many years were going by, the Beane children began having their own children, and so there were multiple generations of this cannibal family, and all eventually participating, at least all of the male children participating in these raids. Now, with the number of Beanes that were going around killing and eating people, sometimes they would overshoot their dietary needs and they would have too much human flesh. Because of the rotting and decay of this excess flesh in the caves, sometimes this would have to be discarded into the outside. And for the authorities, who were already very disturbed by the disappearances, the fact that they now started finding salted and pickled flesh told them something extremely sinister must be going on. And yet the Beanes, by this point, had been living in the caves for more than 2 decades, and it was estimated that over 1,000 people had disappeared during that period. The authorities were feeling great pressure to find the culprits, and there was an expansive search. Unfortunately, while the Beanes were still avoiding detection, there was great suspicion around innkeepers of the area, because often, these being travelers that were the victims, the innkeepers were the last ones to have seen these people alive. And so when there's great pressure, and this is the only person you have that's even a person of interest, there seem to have been some false convictions and even executions of innkeepers. For that reason, the innkeepers that hadn't yet been prosecuted sort of saw which way the wind was blowing and got out of Dodge. This led to the local villages becoming ghost towns of sorts with no accommodations for people to stay. Now, the fatal mistake that the Beane clan made was when they targeted a man with a sword and his wife. Both of them were on horseback. The Beane clan had split into 2 groups to try to attack the duo. One group did, in fact, kill and disembowel the wife. When the man saw this, horrified we can imagine, and knew what fate would befall him if he didn't take drastic measures, he unsheathed his sword and trampled as many Beanes as he could with his horse, stabbing the others. Incidentally, the attention of another group of travelers that happened to be passing by was drawn to this commotion. They came over, saw the Beanes, who were now realizing that they were overtaken, fleeing back to the caves. Thus, the Beanes had left the dead body of a woman and multiple witnesses. The traumatized husband was taken to a magistrate where he told his story. The magistrate was horrified and instructed a message be taken to none other than King James. Now, King James had already been aware of the disappearances, but upon hearing of this latest lead, took the matter extremely seriously, such that he had personally appeared in the area, Galloway, accompanied by an army of 400 men and a vast number of tracker dogs. It was the dogs alerting to a faint scent of decaying human flesh in those cliffside caves that led to the soldiers starting to explore the otherwise inhospitable-looking entrance dark and damp as it was. So there was a strategic operation wherein groups of soldiers were stationed at every possible entrance of the cave, armed to the teeth, taking no chances with this cannibal family, a cannibal army family of its own. And it was a mile into the caves where the front lines of these Kingsmen found the 48 Beanes at the end of that mile-long tunnel. But what they also found were the horrific sights: dried and cured human flesh hanging along the cave. Piles and piles of trinkets and valuables that had been collected next to piles of bones from 2 decades of this cannibal diet. Of course, the Beanes, being the violent type, did attempt a last stand against the Kingsmen, but were hopelessly outnumbered. All were arrested and taken back to Edinburgh. So at this time in Scotland, there were certain crimes considered so horrific that the perpetrators were not considered worthy of a trial. Now, if ever there were a heinous case, it would be that of Sawney Beane and his family. And so there are no official records, neither of court proceedings or of the executions, that can be verified as this being a true event. What was written in later tabloid sorts of publications, perhaps, was that the Beane men were subjected to dismemberment, a punishment that was thought to fit the crime. Their hands and legs were cut off, and they were left to bleed slowly to death while their women watched, and the women were subsequently burned at the stake. It's said that at no point did any of the Beanes show any remorse for these atrocities. Of course, it's possible that the younger Beanes had not had any sense of right and wrong instilled in them. They had only known this life of Sawney Beane the patriarch teaching them how to murder and devour their victims. Now again, this cannot be confirmed by any official records, and so it is possible that this is purely legend, or possible that this is an embellishment, but it is a legend that has persisted in both story and song. There is the Ballad of Sawney Beane. Let me find that. The traditional one, in the sort of Gaelic style English, I guess, includes such lines as, "Go ye not by Galloway, come bide a while, my friend. I'll tell ye o' the dangers there, beware o' Sawney Beane. There's naebody kens that he bides there, for his face is seldom seen, but to meet his eye is to meet your fate at the hands o' Sawney Beane." And then as it talks about his family, "For Sawney he has ta'en a wife, and he's hungry bairns tae wean, and he's raised them up on the flesh o' men in the cave o' Sawney Beane." What else we got? And Sawney has been well endowed, wi' daughters young and lean, and they hae taken, and they hae. Ooh, I think we have to skip that part. That's incest, I think, is against the terms of service, and certainly not something I'm going to support either. And of course, the song's not supporting it. The song is reporting on it. All right. "And Sawney's sons are young and strong, and their blades are sharp and keen, to spill the blood o' travellers wha meet with Sawney Beane. So if ye ride frae there to here, be ye wary in between, lest they catch your horse and spill your blood in the cave of Sawney Beane. So if ye ride frae there to here, be ye wary in between, lest they catch your horse and spill your blood in the cave of Sawney Beane." I don't know the melody, I'm sorry to say. "They'll hing ye up and cut your throat, and they'll picker your carcass clean. They'll yase your bones to quiet the weans in the cave of Sawney Beane. In the cave of Sawney Beane. But fear ye not, our captain rides on an errand o' the queen, for he carries the writ of fire and sword for the head of Sawney Beane." All right, and how does the Ballad of Sawney Beane conclude? They've hung them high in Edinburgh toon, and likewise all their ken. And the wind blaws cold on their bones, and to hell they ahae again. Okay, and to hell they all have gone. That's what that means. They've hung them high in Edinburgh town, and likewise all their ken. And the wind blows cold on their bones, and to hell they all hae gane. And the wind blows cold on all their bones, and to hell they all have gone. So, why is cannibalism? So here's what I was thinking about this. As for the psychology of Sawney Beane, it's hard to get a read on anything other than just sort of an evil incarnate, truly going all the way to beast in human form. I mean, what's really striking about it is he was apparently willing to forego the last sort of social taboo, right? So there's a nature versus nurture question on why most of us are horrified and or disgusted by cannibalism. And so on the nurture side, I could speculate on some psychosocial theories. One would be that humans need to cooperate. To have a civilization, we need to all cooperate such that we should all probably see each other as beings that are not beasts of the field, right? We should not see each other the same way that ancient man saw, deer or wildebeests or such. So having a sense of sacredness about the body, that it should not be eaten, is a sensible kind of social institution. And it may be that, with some social taboos, why do they have to be taboo? Why does society have to teach them? Maybe it's because they're the things that on a kind of primal level, we don't have the instinct yet. I don't know. If we weren't taught certain messages, we don't really know which things we would have natural instincts about. I think there are certain smells that we associate with uncleanliness, like, say, smells associated with the bathroom, that I don't know that society has to teach us so much not to do things with our bathroom waste. That's sort of, to me, that's something I would guess is instinctual, because there's such risk of infection if you like the smell, or, you know what I mean? I don't need to get into it too much. But I think there are other things that society has to take on the role of messaging to a much stronger extent, because maybe we haven't evolved the instinct yet to avoid certain things. And so I'm wondering, maybe cannibalism is one of those, that it's the ultimate taboo because it needs to be the ultimate taboo. We need to be taught to think of it as extremely unnatural so that we can function as a cooperative society, see each other as more than meat. And thus, most of us, because we've received this messaging, are in fact repulsed by cannibalism. And then the other possibility is that actually it is an instinct in most of us, that we are just naturally repulsed or horrified by it, and society didn't have to tell us that. That's possible too. And I do think one thing that argues in favor of us having a sort of natural selection derived instinct against cannibalism would be the type of spooky disease that is associated with it. Unique diseases associated with the consumption of human organs. Not only human organs, but certainly we know that it happened in societies where they consumed humans. At least I learned this in medical school, okay, about Papua New Guinea, a tribe there that had practiced cannibalism, and the prion disease, kuru. So this is a spongiform encephalopathy. It's like mad cow disease in that it's a spongiform encephalopathy. It's neurodegenerative. And the pathology of kuru is prions. So how do prions work? So this is an infectious protein. Now here's what's spooky about prions. We all have proteins that are the building blocks of our bodies and our cells, our organs. A prion is a protein that is misfolded that can induce other proteins, your own proteins that make up your own body. It can induce them to also take on this misfolded shape. One protein that you ingest can convince your proteins in your brain to fold in this same pathological way. It's like one bad apple spoiling the bunch. Your proteins of your whole life have all known how to fold themselves, and yet you introduce this one bad seed, this one protein, and the next thing you know, they're all going to the dark side, all going to the misfolded prion shape. And the next thing you know, you have holes, sponge-like holes in your brain. Now, how is this possible? Is this like Einstein's spooky action at a distance? One misfolded protein enters into the brain, and all of these other ones say, oh, we do that. We do that now. And cells fall apart. Okay. I'm going to stop doing the organ sounds. Well, no, it's not actually happening just across distance by some mysterious means. We don't think. The truth is we don't know how it happens. But there are a couple models of it, theories of how it might be happening. Give me that prion article, Wikipedia. So this is here's a microscope slide of the sponge-like changes in the cerebrum. So in brain, you start getting these sponge-like holes in people with prion diseases. Creutzfeldt-Jakob is probably the most common one, prion-based disease. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy is what's colloquially called mad cow disease. But cannibalism causes prion-based spongiform encephalopathy, as we know from that remote tribe. And so how does it happen? So these proteins just sort of diffusing around, doing their thing. You get the infected protein, which the infection is just the same protein but folded differently. The heterodimer model would be that proteins can go around and interact with each other. So let's say you have your misfolded one and here's a normal folded one. If the two of them bind and the normal protein is now induced to be misfolded, and now it can go around and bind other proteins and induce them to misfold into this prion shape. This has never been borne out because heterodimers of prions have never been isolated, as far as I know. The other possibility that I guess is thought to be more common now is the fibril model. So if you can see here. So here you have your misfolded proteins are basically all conglomerating together in the fibril model. So they're making this fibrous blob. It's sort of like that horror movie, The Blob. So these proteins that are misfolded start aggregating together. Rather than going around separating and sticking, they start making a blob. And so when other proteins come along, they get joined into this fibril. They misfold. Here the misfolding is basically shown as going from a circle to a square. Okay, so the circles are the normal healthy proteins. They're floating around. Sometimes they'll hit this expanding blob of the square misfolded proteins. And then you get this fibrous, diseased growth of misfolded proteins. Little chunks of that may break off and then go attract other healthy proteins to join the dark side and become prions. And of course, these misfolded proteins don't function normally. They lead to the breakdown of cerebral cortex, and you end up with things like mad cow disease or Kuru. And it's very spooky because these misfolded proteins do not respond to normal denaturing. So heat will not change these prions. They are forever diseased. And so that's all to say one reason we should not engage in cannibalism is because of the risk of spongiform encephalopathy from prion diseases. Perhaps that is a reason we are so horrified by people like Sawney Beane. But that's potentially in addition to the point I made earlier that we probably just shouldn't see each other as mere meat or beasts of the field if we want to have anything like a functioning civilization, which I do, Halloween or not. Let's stay civilized and let's scare off the ghosts, right? Let's scare off the ghosts and scare off the prions. Happy Halloween.